So in your book, I mean, the book's obviously called Laziness Does Not Exist. And you talk a lot in this book about the laziness lie. And you mentioned that I think there's like 4 or 5 parts to it. Basically, you say that I must work incredibly hard all the time to overcome this inner laziness. My worth is earned through my productivity. Work is the center of our life, especially as an American. I mean, you meet someone from another country, oftentimes you don't even know what they do for work. But in America, like the first question you ask someone is like, oh, what do you do for work? Right? It's kind of like your whole identity is wrapped up in this profession. And then lastly, anyone who isn't accomplished and driven is immoral. So they're just not a good person because they don't have a good job. Is that kind of like the American philosophy? So just, I mean, one, I guess, can you just kind of explain the general thesis of the book, and we can talk about the laziness lie as we go through this book, right?
Yeah. So some of the things that you've just listed off are really common American values, or these implicit beliefs that a lot of us move through with our whole lives. And I tie all this back to something that I call the laziness lie, which is a set of beliefs that has its origins in Puritanism from the early days of when the United States was being settled and colonized. And the real core 3 premises really underlying the laziness lie are: one, that your worth is defined by your productivity. So a person who can't generate some kind of value for somebody else is seen as worthless. The second tenet is that you can't trust any of your needs or limits, because if you're tired, if you are disabled, if there's anything that's getting in the way of your ability to be productive, that is a threat to your human value. So you can't trust any of your needs and limits, which causes us a whole ton of problems in taking care of ourselves and other people. And then the third kind of core tenet of the laziness lie is that there is always more that you could be doing. So even if you are one of those superhuman productive types who is logging 60, 70, 80-hour weeks, you can still be made to feel like you're inadequate because you're not getting your kids in enough extracurriculars. Your home isn't spotless. You are not doing enough volunteer work. You're not working out at the gym to make your body look flawless. There's actually this endless list of standards that you are expected to meet to prove that you are a virtuous enough human being, that you really have human value. And it's just impossible. Nobody can actually meet even any of one of those standards. Most of us can't meet, like having the perfect body or whatever, let alone all of them at the same time.
Have you ever read the book Bullshit Jobs at all?
Yes, David Graeber. I was really lucky that we briefly got to interact before he passed, but I would consider Bullshit Jobs and my work part of the same conversation. Absolutely.
So you actually met David Graeber. That's pretty awesome.
Oh, we just talked a little bit on Twitter, just as my first book was coming out. But yeah, his work is a massive, massive inspiration to me. Huge fan.
When I was reading your book, Laziness Does Not Exist, I was completely thinking about that, but I've read that book maybe 2 or 3 times. It started out like in 2013 as an essay, and then he made it into a book, I think in like 2018. But I guess how do your book and his book kind of overlap, would you say?
Yeah, I think Bullshit Jobs, which I am a massive fan of, I think it describes a lot of decisions in the structure of the American workplace on the management level that creates a lot of high-paying jobs, high-status jobs that really contribute nothing meaningful to human people's lives, where some of the jobs that are the most compensated in our economy are jobs where you are not teaching people, you're not helping people, you're not treating, you're not even necessarily treating people's illnesses. You're just managing staff who themselves might have jobs that they feel are useless and unfulfilling. And that book really illustrates how a lot of what is prioritized under our current economic model is just your membership within a existing hierarchy and maintaining an organization, not even actually producing anything that helps people or that society necessarily needs. So I think he takes a really great kind of higher level look at like, how did we get into being in that position right now? And I think Laziness Does Not Exist really talks about our cultural beliefs surrounding work going back the last several hundred years, and how that has affected things like our approach to social welfare, or even things like reparations after slavery, where if you have a culture that really firmly believes every person needs to be completely independent, that the only humans who have value are people who can work enough to pay the bills for themselves and never lean on anybody for help, that is an ideology that makes it very easy for people to write off someone who can't find a job because they are depressed or because they have ADHD and they can't quite structure their day to get it done without help, or because their skills are just not relevant in the job market anymore, which is happening to more and more people these days. If you have these beliefs that a person has to earn the right to live through work and that anybody who's struggling is just immoral and lazy, and you don't have that appreciation for the greater context, that makes it very easy to just not to say, okay, we're just not going to have unemployment benefits that are generous, to have welfare, to have things like health care for everyone, because those people don't deserve it. And though that ideology really infects most Americans, I think it makes us really beat ourselves up and not trust any feeling that we have when we are in need of support. And it also makes us turn against other people. So that's what I really wanted to set out to highlight in the book, is how much we not only overwork ourselves because of all of these things, but we also turn this judgment against anyone we see on the street asking for money, anybody who's struggling. We just say, oh, they're just lazy. And we don't have curiosity about what is in their way, and what support do they need. We don't even want to, as a culture, even give them that support at all.
Your book was published, was it January of 2021? And ChatGPT came out November 30th of 2022. So the following year, almost 2 years later, I guess. What would be an updated chapter, or would the book be different with kind of AI really factoring a lot more heavily into the equation now than when this book came out?
You know, all of the technological dynamics that I talk about in the book have only gotten so much worse. So in the book, I talk about things like work-life interference, which is this idea in the social science literature that if you have technology that makes you reachable by your bosses everywhere you go, then that means work is going to bleed into almost every waking moment, which means you're never going to be able to de-stress or have your own identity that's separate from work. And it just really contributes to burnout and unwellness and all kinds of negative outcomes for people. So that was already a problem when email became a thing. And then it got worse with the advent of smartphones, where your boss could call you at any time. And then Slack and Microsoft Teams meant that you were expected to be chatting with your coworkers and like shown as active on your device all day long. And technological advancements had, in theory, made work more flexible and efficient, which should be a good thing. But we never saw that translate to workers not having to work as many hours because, hey, I can get just as much work done in less time. So shouldn't I have a 4-hour work day instead of an 8-hour work day? So we saw people were instead just having expectations that ratcheted up and up, where they were expected to just be even more productive with these tools. And now ChatGPT has really furthered this in a really extreme way, where a lot of workplaces, they don't value writing, editing, video editing, production, even something like exchanging an email and appreciating that crafting a message requires time and forethought, and that you are paying workers for their ability to think. Now everything is just processed in terms of output. What is the deliverable? Have as many deliverables as possible, and we need it right now. And we're not going to really put any thought into the human being who produced it and what that human being's like body and mind needs. So we were already, I think, in the American workplace treating people like machines as much as possible. But now we literally do have machines that we can just demand produce work for us nonstop without ever caring about are they going to get burned out? And so what we see is that workers are treated as more disposable. Workers are expected to produce even more now that they have the streamlining technology of ChatGPT. And even with how much these technologies in theory allow faster or more efficient production, because these things can be used in beneficial ways. I know a lot of researchers who use it to create tables and visualizations to streamline lots of processes. But that efficiency is not translating to people having a better quality of life or better work-life balance, quite the opposite. And in fact, more people losing their jobs and therefore being more and more desperate in the workplace to hold on to whatever work they have, which makes them really easy to exploit.
Have you ever read the book, The Status Game?
I have not, no.
In the book, it just talks about the different hierarchies in human society, but it talks about how people constantly strive for status. And it kind of goes back into David's book with bullshit jobs, where he talks about, like, he has he has 5 types of bullshit jobs. He has the flunkies, the goons, the duct tapers, the box tickers, and the taskmasters. And for example, like the flunkies, this would be defined as these jobs only exist to make someone else look or feel more important, which could be having a bunch of receptionists, a bunch of assistants. And then this is a quote from his book. He says, when executives realize that those efficiencies will have the effect of automating away a significant portion of their subordinates, by doing so, they would effectively reduce managers that do nothing. And without flunkies, who would they be superior to? Right. So like the more people you manage, generally, the more money you make. So you want to have a bigger team, not because you have more work to do, but because it gives you more status. And I guess in particular in the US, where a lot of people, it's kind of like this double-edged sword. Like you grow up in a society where it's like, hey, get a good job to have status or have identity or whatnot. But then you get it. And then you kind of realize, like, hey, maybe your job is like not that important. But at the same time, like, you went to school for like 10 years, you got these advanced degrees and all this, that. And now you have to justify.
Yeah, I think especially in bullshit jobs, a lot of what David Graeber talks about with those hierarchy elements, it really reminds me of like when you read about like palace life, especially in bullshit jobs, a lot of what David Graeber talks about with regard to the role of hierarchy and how symbolic it is of power. It reminds me so much of when you read about like palace life in the Middle Ages, or when like the Catholic Church was at the height of its political influence, where and still like academia today still often operates in a lot of these ways, where a lot of the role that you are fulfilling is this symbolic one of maintaining the superstructure of the organization that you are a part of. And I think in corporate American culture, it's very much that too, where your role isn't necessarily to make anything, not even necessarily to make a profit or generate any output once you get to the higher levels of influence. It's about representing the company, and the more layers of status there are, not only, the more important you are, the more people you have under you, but also like the more exalted and powerful the company is, the more structures it has, and people and like layers of influence it has within it. And it really is a very interesting set of priorities that is reflected in our culture, that somebody's identity is through their belonging to one of these organizations. And speaking for myself, people in academia cannot wrap their brains around it when I don't want to take on a quote unquote opportunity, or I want to take time for myself or a hobby or a passion, or like when I have a medical issue and I'm just like accepting it. Like it really does not compute in like the American professional psyche that you would have a life and identity outside of your work, and that you might reach a point in your career where you're just satisfied. Like, just speaking from my own perspective, I'm a professor. I enjoy the teaching aspect. I don't want to really move up any higher because I've had really bad burnout in the past. And I want to have a life that's fully realized with friendship and hobbies and creativity and like pleasure. And it just is like, it's sacrilegious to people. I think just in the same way that like corporate American culture, the academy, these things are like the old, like, imperial like Catholic Church. These things are our religion. They are like what Americans orient their life purpose around. And so when you say, I actually don't need to achieve anything more, I'm lucky enough to be comfortable, and I'd like to just find meaning in other ways, it is like you were saying, in like the 1400s, that like God does not exist or something like that. Like people think you're evil for it.
Yeah, I found it interesting because in your book, you're talking about how you never really cared about getting tenure. And I think unless you're in academia, you probably don't realize how competitive academia is, but you're thinking like, oh, like you went to school to get a professor job and maybe it's a little bit more relaxed. You have 2 semesters, a summer off, winter break. But the fact is, unless you're tenured, it's the whole, publish or perish. It's a hyper competitive. Not many, what percentage of professors are even tenured? I mean, a lot of the classes are run by adjuncts, professors. You have a lot of, whether they're GAs or TAs that are teaching classes. I'm not even sure at most universities if even, it's probably less than 10%, I would guess, of professors are even tenured, right? So it's like a hyper competitive atmosphere in a place where most people probably think like, oh, this is probably kind of a laid back atmosphere, but and that's academia. Can you imagine cutthroat jobs like finance on Wall Street or, Hollywood? Name any other industry that's a lot of careers at stake. I mean, politics, come on, like it's high pressure jobs. This is academia and you're still cutthroat. I found that part to be insane. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to get tenure. Like, yeah, after all that stress, I agree. Being sick and everything you went through, I don't blame you for not wanting to go for tenure.
Yeah, you are exactly right that the landscape is that ridiculous. And it really dates back to at least Reagan, where there have been such massive cuts to federal and state funding of universities that universities pivoted to relying on donors to be able to fund themselves around the 80s and 90s. And with donors, that meant they needed more people to court the donors and try and get these, donations. And so that meant that universities started around that time investing massively in administrators, managers, basically representatives of the university, not teachers. And Karen Kelsky, she writes about this beautifully in her book, The Professor is In. She's a great person to talk to potentially, by the way. Over the years, we see that the number of administrative and management positions in academia has increased, and every year the number of full-time teaching jobs has decreased every single year. So we are at the point now where you have sometimes dozens or hundreds of provosts and associate deans and people running committees who never teach a class. All they do is meet with donors and have meetings and do these kind of symbolic, in my opinion, bullshit jobs. And then you have a fleet of, at my university, the last time somebody calculated it, it was 75% adjunct. 75% of our courses were taught by part-timers who were their contracts were course by course, no guarantee that you would get picked up for an additional course after the semester ended. And you're making like maybe $3,000 to $5,000 for a 16-week semester, and you probably are teaching it like, when I was an adjunct, I was teaching at like 3 or 4 other campuses every year just to be able to make rent and make like $30,000 a year. And so this is the higher ed that people are like going into debt to get their kids college educations for, that the teacher is an adjunct who's like exhausted and has to work at like 3 community colleges and 1 university, has no job security, has no chance to really invest in making their classes better. And that is like the high value, quote unquote, education that's being sold to people. And predominantly now it's only being sold as, you need this university degree so you can get a job. And do we actually see that connection anymore between having a higher ed degree and getting a job? Not so much, especially in a post language learning model landscape where tons of tech jobs have been decimated and a lot of industries are really struggling, or a lot of people are struggling to find work in their industries. So a lot of our value systems in the US, like the bottom has fallen out on them, and it's a period of really incredible destabilization. And just to give you like a taste, when I was graduating in 2015 with my PhD, I had a friend who applied to 168 jobs in 1 year, tenure track jobs. She got 2 on-campus interviews and she didn't of course, get a job. A lot of people have to apply for years to be able to even get a job. And that's the landscape we're looking at, like so many other Americans in so many other industries.
At Loyola University, you said 75% of professors are adjunct. How does that other 25% break down? Because just because you're full-time doesn't mean that you're tenured. So how would that, and then is that including GAs or TAs, or so how would that other 25% even break down? Because I feel like that 75% of, say, part-time professors is probably even quite a bit higher than 75%, or maybe I'm reading that wrong.
No, I think that's accurate. So that statistic came from a colleague of mine of several years ago. She really went through the full course book for that year and looked up each faculty member, and it was roughly 75% of classes were taught by someone who was not a full-time professor, or a tenured professor. So once you get into that 25%, then you also have lecturers. So those people might have a 1 to 3 year contract, and they might have a teaching job with a little bit more security, but they are still disposable at essentially any time. And they can be assigned whatever class their dean, their bosses want them to teach. Sometimes they are forced into an early retirement by just having more and more courses add to their course load, or there's just interdepartmental politics and they're moved around. I myself am not tenure track. I am what's called a clinical associate professor. And what that means is I have a lot of administrative duties. So I can be assigned to committees basically unlimitedly. Whatever I'm told I have to do, I have to do. That fantasy that I had going into academia of, oh, I'll just work from September to May is not true. You know, I teach 2 courses in the summer and I have meetings and events. I'm also really expected to be involved in recruitment. So academia is facing something right now called the demographic cliff, where basically there are a lot fewer Zoomers than there were millennials. And endless growth under capitalism is impossible. So universities had budget projections that their number of students would get larger and larger every year. And there's fewer conventional age undergrads, 18, 19-year-olds, that exist now than used to exist. So universities are not making enough money. They're not getting the enrollments that they used to. And they offload that pressure onto people like me. And they tell me like that I need to go to community colleges to recruit new students, that we need to run events in the evening to recruit new students, and info sessions. Like I have to do an advertising role, essentially. Some of us are asked to make social media posts advertising our universities. And one time they even tried to get me to like cold call students, prospective students who had put in applications. So we're taking on multiple different roles of like essentially selling the university if we want to keep our jobs.
We just talked a little bit about AI, but how, like, you know, talking about there's this demographic cliff, and I've done a few podcasts on higher education. And I believe it was somewhere around since 2010 or 2011, the enrollment of universities has actually decreased every year. And I think the scary part for a university is the fact that the peak was this past year, the graduating class of 2025, the high school class, was the biggest class in the history of the US of A, which means that, like, yeah, you know, when you had the dropping of college enrollment, we actually had an increase of the high school graduating class. Now in 2025, 2026, every following year, that class actually shrinks. But then you add in the fact is AI. So it's like, if you're projecting out like, hey, what career can I have in 10, 15 years? You're probably thinking maybe a little bit more manual labor, maybe a nurse. You know, medical is always going to be big, especially with an aging population. So I think medical is always probably safe, but you're thinking, okay, maybe I'll be a plumber, maybe I'll be a electrician, maybe I'll do welding, maybe something that's not quite, you know, they call it like the knowledge economy, but you know, the knowledge economy, it shape shifts depending on how technology ebbs and flows. But I think manual labor, you always kind of feel, or at least, you know, our version of manual labor, it's not like you're out there with a pickaxe, you know, like hoeing potatoes or something, you know, back in the agricultural revolution or something like that. But I guess the question is someone like yourself that's actually in academia, what would be like the advice if you're not thinking about your own, like, hey, I need to get more customers to the university? If you're just thinking it like as a parent or as a friend to someone that's asking you, what would be your advice about going to university or picking a career the next 10 years based on what we've just discussed?
I think my advice would be whatever you do go into as little debt as possible. That I think for many of us, we were of a generation where we were told you need to get a good degree from a good school, and that will lay out the connections and the credentials that will make economic possibilities for you. And we do not see that. I think a lot of us millennials also did not live that. I remember the Great Recession, in 2008, 2009, and so on. A lot of people of my generation had this experience of not being able to enter the workforce and not seeing any relevance between their degree and what jobs are actually available now. And now that's just so much more pronounced, and things are changing so quickly with technological advancements that you can't predict what kind of skills are even going to still be done by humans or paid for by a society in the years that come forward. So I think really universities made a bad decision decades ago when they decided to start presenting themselves as a jobs program more than anything else. There's used to be this idea of a liberal arts education, that the purpose of an education was to make you a more rounded citizen of the world and human being, where you would learn kind of foundational philosophical skills and history and English and like these aspects of being a human being that would kind of be relevant no matter what you did. And then we really pivoted to, oh no, we're going to sell you a computer science degree so you can get a job as a programmer or whatever, or a system administrator. And what do you do when that job no longer exists, right? If you're trained only to be an engineer in a particular field of engineering that then no longer has demand, then you're screwed. And so if I were a parent or if I were a young person today deciding, how do I navigate this minefield? I would say, you may decide for yourself that you want to learn, you have a hunger to learn, and there are skills that you do want to develop or knowledge bases you want to develop for yourself. And if that's why you want to go to school, by all means, but don't go into debt for it the way so many people of my generation did, where they're still looking at 6 figures or close to 6 figures in debt for a credential that did not translate to any earnings for them. And I would say focus on what you actually think is going to be useful for you in a holistic way as a human being, not, I want to work this job is going to pay well, and so I'm going to get this degree that's going to get me that job, because that really might not happen. And we've seen it time and time again with a lot of industries where tons of people went to coding boot camp because coding jobs were paying well. And now that floods the market, even pre-ChatGPT. The more people have that credential, the less valuable it is, the less competitive it is. And so you're not going to get those returns on investment you thought. But then today, again, with large language learning models, there is no guarantee of these things. So don't let universities trick you with the sales pitch, because that's, unfortunately, I do believe in education, right? But I don't think that's necessarily always what we're actually giving out at these institutions at this point.
If you could do it over again, Devon, you're just graduating high school, you got the opportunity, go to university or whatever. Would you change anything? Hindsight's 2020. What would you do? Would you do the same thing, something differently, or would you, everyone says follow your passion. I mean, all that stuff. Would you follow the passion? What would you do?
I am someone who was lucky in the sense that even though a career as a tenured psychologist ended up not being the right fit for me, I was still able to use that knowledge in what I consider my real pursuit now, which is in writing and giving interviews like this and discussing ideas and social problems. I think I probably, if I were a teenager now, I would probably be a lot like those many, many Zoomers who their aspiration is to be a content creator or an influencer. There's a very dark side to that stuff, but I also think where I've been able to make the most influence in the world is by translating scientific information into a language that lots of everyday people can approach it and take that knowledge and research on things like burnout and productivity out of the ivory tower and try to reach as many burned out, overworked, exhausted people as I can. And I think, there feels like there's very little stability in any institution or any kind of work where you're beholden to an employer today. And so even though aiming to be like an influencer or a content creator is also a losing game for a lot of people. I feel like I would probably end up focusing on my writing and video production, which is mostly the stuff that I do now, because at least you're your own boss and you have control over it. And it seems like the days of being able to rely on having a steady job with an employer are just crumbling away. So I do not envy people who are making these decisions right now, because a lot of it just comes down to extreme luck and fortunate timing, because there's very little that you can kind of hold on to as a sure bet in our economy now.
Yeah, so living abroad, one of the things I always appreciated for other countries is like that gap year between high school and university, especially now, like when the cost of education is so much money, where this is a decision that will impact you in your 50s and 60s. I'm not sure if you know who Dr. Marion Nestle is, but she is a famous molecular biologist who was part of like the food pyramid, and she was on the podcast, and she's in her mid or upper 80s, but she went to Berkeley in I think it was the early 1960s, and she paid like $25 a semester, like that. And even if you factor in inflation, it was, you work a part-time job for 6 months and you pay off your university, right? So you could do whatever you wanted, because like at that point, like education was just education. And it was just to learn and to grow as a person. And it didn't matter what you went for, because it was just, you could afford it just working as a server, a bartender, just some whatever job. But now when you graduate and you got 80, 90, 100,000 in debt, I mean, the average person in debt last year was right around $40,000. So it's a pretty sizable chunk of money. And so when you kind of look at it as like, you're making, I think that just the gap year where you have a chance to get out of high school, explore the world, figure out what you like, and instead of committing to something that maybe you're not going to like, or picking a major just because you're worried about the price tag and finding a job and then having a career that you hate, where you're saying laziness doesn't exist. You could be the most motivated person in the world, but you get a job that you hate, that you're picking because you're trying to make money, whether it's, maybe you get a job in finance. You hate finance, but it's like, well, I got to justify this $80,000 price tag on this college education versus, hey, I can take a lower paying job that I really am passionate about. And, it's the whole expression where like, it's not work when you love it, whatever. I feel like there's simple changes we can make where it would really have a massive impact. And I personally think the gap year granted, obviously cheaper education, right? But I don't think that's going to happen. But what do you think of something like people just being, hey, I'm 18 years old, like let's just have some fun for a year and figure shit out.
Yeah. I think we really need a really fundamental value shift that reflects the reality that we're now in. And I think we do see that in the younger generations. Like there is some data showing that they don't see careers as important as their parents and older siblings of other generations kind of look at these things. I think people, especially people of my generation, we were told, you need to get a college degree, you need to get a quote unquote good job, right? And what does a good job mean? It's usually like a David Graeber style bullshit job, some kind of corporate management job that you need a college degree for. And I think we really can shift our cultural expectations into saying there is nothing wrong with just working a job that puts a minimum amount of stress on you, that helps you get by, that you didn't have to go into debt to be able to get that job, and to just coast on that. There's nothing wrong or shameful with being a stock person at the grocery store, with being a barista your whole life. You don't need to just like be a barista to put yourself through college. If you're comfortable doing that work, that is important work that is a part of society that I know a lot of us rely on our coffee, right? Like you're doing something for the world. If you're producing food, there's nothing more essential than feeding other people. There's nothing shameful in being a cook, in being a server, and not aspiring to do some elite position that 9 times out of 10, if you're talking about some corporate job, is bringing so much like damage to the environment and the economy. Why is that seen as more prestigious than feeding people or babysitting children or helping bathe elders, And if as a culture, we could shift to the point where we recognize that what we are all here for, what this is all about, what it should be all about, is human life and people having a positive quality of life, then I think we would see and understand that it's not about accumulating wealth. It's not about rising up the corporate ladder and destroying the environment. It's about feeding each other, taking care of each other when we're sick, bathing each other, raising children, looking after each other, looking after our planet. And are those things in our current economic structure high paying, high status jobs? No, but a life where you do a little bit of something meaningful like that, and then you have free time to like make music, paint, go running, hang out with your friends, that seems like a better life. And it's not too late for us to restructure things so that people actually have the freedom to enjoy these things. As you've already said, in other countries, we see a lot more of that, where there is enough of a social welfare net, where people are not working all of the time. And if they can't find a job, they have a bit of a cushion. And I think we need to do more of that, because what is the point of AI streamlining all of these things so that humans don't have to work anymore, and then we punish the humans for the fact that they aren't needed anymore? Shouldn't all of that value be redirected into making our lives more comfortable and vibrant? We can still do that.
In the book Bullshit Jobs, one of the things I thought was interesting is that David talks about how you had like the Soviet Union, which is like everyone gets a job. Or is it like, we'll give you a job and we'll pretend to pay you, whatever the expression is. And then, but he talks about how the U.S., like everyone in the U.S. will talk about bureaucracy with the public sector, but the private sector is just as bureaucratic. All you have to do is go to a bank. I mean, hell, try like changing, you spell your name wrong accidentally or put the wrong birthday in for your flight. Try changing that. It's hours on the phone to just make a simple change. Like that's bureaucracy in a private company. Like it's all over. But I was then thinking, like, what is we have the Federal Reserve in the U.S. and we have the Federal Reserve has the dual mandate, which is price stability, aka inflation, which is somewhere around 2%. But then it's maximum employment. So if you try to have maximum employment, it's no different than Soviet Russia, where we're just creating crap jobs all around us just because that's what the mandate of the government is maximum employment, whatever that even means. Like, are these jobs benefiting anybody? And that's kind of like the whole point of the bullshit job, is like no one's benefiting from the bullshit job. Like there are jobs that are essential, but if everyone's employed, you keep revolutions down, you keep people in line, keep people at their level of status in life. And I mean, he talks a lot about feudalism, and I don't know. I guess I kind of agree with what he has to say.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind in all you're saying is how much the jobs that we do have don't necessarily translate to what society needs to get done. Like our roads are full of potholes. We have crumbling bridges. Right here in Chicago, right on my corner, there's a hospital that shut down. It was one of the hospitals serving the most unhoused people and seniors in my area. It was shut down because they hadn't updated the HVAC system. And so it's not safe to be in. Somebody should be working on that, right? There is work that needs to get done in this world. There's teacher shortages, right? There's going to be a massive shortage of doctors and nurses. We already are experiencing that, but projections are that it's about to get a lot worse as the years go on. But we are not allocating the resources into making those jobs appealing, in even creating or paying for a lot of those jobs, especially infrastructure and teaching. And so instead, we have people fighting to get these handful of corporate jobs, of they're driving Uber Eats, they're doing whatever like part-time gig economy work that they can find. And meanwhile, there is meaningful work that needs to be done, but nobody's paying for it. Our government isn't paying for it. Instead, they're giving massive tax write-offs to Amazon and grants to OpenAI and things like that, or into the military. We're not prioritizing things with the real human touch. And that, I think, goes back to what is prioritized in our current economic structure. There's a lot of different ways to measure the health of an economy. Unemployment is one way to look at it, inflation and so on. And we've been hearing for years, right, that the economy isn't as bad as it actually is, right? Like that gaslighting that the American people have been getting. But when you look at people's actual lives, they can't find jobs. The jobs are meaningless and they can't afford to pay for the food they need or access services they need, like medical care. And so this is not tenable. It's all heading towards a massive breakdown. And that is, as you said, when you start to see revolutions and people rioting in the streets, because people are starting to really, I think, become very aware of that. They see their bridges falling and their hospitals getting shut down. And they're saying, what gives? Is this the American dream? Is this the greatest country on earth mythology that we've been indoctrinated into? No, I think we can do better than this.
In the book, like David talks about people that actually have real productive jobs, like a server, you cut hair. There's actual people that have real jobs, or teachers he uses, and then people are resentful because those people actually have a job that gives them meaning and purpose in their life versus just a job that gives them a paycheck that they can't stand to go to. And he talks a lot about how, like, if you look at, he had a graph where it has like agriculture, right? Like agriculture used to be a big part of the job sector, and it's just like gone down to like less than 2%. So people that are actually like putting food on the table, right? What's the expression? Like who's bringing home the bacon, right? Well, not many people are literally bringing home the bacon like they used to. And then the other one is manufacturing or industry, which is kind of ebbed and flow, but it's not really doesn't move that much more than 5 to 10 percentage points depending on a decade. But it's the service economy. The service economy has just gone the complete opposite direction. And there's a lot of jobs in the service economy. Again, it could be a server, it could be a waitress, could be a haircut specialist, but a lot of it is just like that, the quote unquote professional managerial class, or just a lot of bureaucratic jobs. And those are the ones that are jealous of the people that actually create real meaning in people's lives. And this, kind of what you're saying, I kind of like you actually have a job that benefits people, and then other people are resentful because they actually want to get meaning, but then because your job doesn't have meaning, now you feel all these other obligations to like update you have to do outreach on social media, and then you have to attend conferences and try to like just make this job seem a lot more impactful than it really is. But then you also know that it's not impactful. So then it's just kind of, it's like the whole, catch-22 with Joseph Keller's book.
Yeah. I really loved that insight in Bullshit Jobs about that resentment. I think we also see it in how people approach any kind of art, right? People think that like if you get to make art, you're so lucky and you should be willing to work for pennies to make art. I also see it a lot in the nonprofit sector where people are incredibly overworked and burned out. And you're looking at people who are logging, again, 70, 80-hour work weeks, and they're making like $30,000 a year working as like a social worker or working in social services, doing something that hopefully is trying to at least make people's lives better, but it is seen as this like moral sacrifice that you have to make, that you, because you're doing something virtuous, because you believe in it, because it's like a good thing, you should be willing to just sacrifice everything for it and just live and die for the cause or like for your nonprofit's like mission. And so then you don't get compensated. So it is this real inversion of values in our economic system where the jobs that pay the most are the ones that generally are the most destructive toward the world. And the jobs that pay the least are the ones where they're essential and they're part of the rhythms of everyday life, or you're trying to make somebody's life better or do something that makes a difference. But because you have the luxury of not hating your job, you don't get to eat.
You think we'll see a change in the next 10 years just with AI? Like theoretically, some jobs that are fairly repetitive, redundant could just be outsourced to say AI, LLMs. Even if they don't improve that much, I think there's just on its current kind of iteration, we should be able to see some improvement. But then at a societal level, that's a completely different question. I talked with some of my friends that work in a hospital where it's like a nurse. I mean, depending on the hospital, but a nurse might spend 75% of her day charting or his day charting, which is 3/4 of the day. That's a big chunk, which means you're just sitting behind a computer and putting in data, so to speak, which seems like it's pretty easy to automate. Never mind the regulations behind it. But my thought process is, even if you were to outsource that, some of the nurses I've talked to are like, well, we'll just have more time to spend with the patients, and that's better care that we'll be able to provide. My thought process is like, well, probably not. They'll probably just lay off 75% of the nurses, and those patients will get the exact same level of care they're getting now. So like, I mean, the technology, like we said, it could always be used to benefit people, or could you be used to replace people? What do you think with the next, I don't know, I guess say decade, do you think we're going to get to the point where we're going to be working less hours, less stressed? A lot of this, the easy, redundant stuff will be offloaded, or will it just be used to cut wages, cut workers, replace people?
I think, unfortunately, the latter. I think there could be a world in which having these technologies meant that we could all collectively reap the benefits. So I'll just go with an example as a researcher, how these things impact science. Technology has done a lot over the years to make it more efficient to run a psychological study or a medical study and analyze the data, collect the data, analyze the data, chart the data. That even started just with like the advent of computers, right? Like it used to be scientists had to like write down their equations by hand and compute their own averages. And back in those days, if you wanted to publish a study as a scientist, you would usually only publish one study at a time, and performing one single study with one group of subjects could take you all year or multiple years. But then you publish that one study, and that was, being a productive scientist, right? Then we had computers that made it much easier to analyze data, to compile data, and it gave us more efficiency. In theory, that's great, right? That means a scientist doesn't need to they have more time freed up to come up with great study ideas, and that should pay off and benefit them. But the impact that ended up having in academia is, okay, now you're expected to publish 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 studies in a single paper, but that still only counts as one paper. So you need to perform far more studies than you used to do in order to keep your job and be competitive. So we see on the one hand, oh my God, this huge jump in efficiency. That's great. We can do so much more science. That is a good thing. And I think the same thing's true with ChatGPT. It can make research more efficient. But when it translates to ratcheting up the expectations for the human being of, okay, well now ChatGPT has streamlined this thing for you. So now instead of writing this one paper, you need to write a dozen papers because you're not really writing it, quote unquote, you're using ChatGPT or whatever your job is. That means that you're actually working longer hours, you're seeing less benefits and compensation, you're in a more competitive market where you are more disposable. And so unfortunately, I think there is great potential in these tools. I think it already has really helped with medicine, with neuroimaging studies, lots of different aspects of just human processes that can be streamlined, but that's not translating to great. That means that people shouldn't have to work as hard and should enjoy a reasonable level of comfort. We're not passing that wealth along to other people. And as long as our world is shaped by like corporate overlords and government figures that are like getting all their campaign donations from those people, like I think that's unfortunately the direction that we're going to go.
As your book is titled, Laziness Does Not Exist. And I know that in this book, you kind of talk about, especially at the beginning where you're talking about how you just worked yourself into a sickness. And, like my fiance, she has a similar thing. I mean, she's from the Philippines and, just grew up differently, but like, it's like if she's not working, she just feels like, she get like the anxiety and the fear of like, I got to be working all the time. And you kind of had that. How did you, and I think a lot of people in the US have that. It's not just the Philippines. I mean, Costa Rica, works a lot of hours. South Korea, Japan, there's a lot of cultures around the world where these people work themselves to death and they have high suicides because they're so stressed out. So like, I mean, this is like a thing that impacts hundreds of millions of people around the world. How do you actually break out of having this anxiety and this fear and working yourself? You have the flu and you're still working and you're just like, you can't get like, it's an addiction, or is it not? I don't know, just, it's like you're a core of yourself, but you need to change it because it's killing you and no one cares. Like if you get sick and you miss 3 weeks, they'll just replace you or whatever. Or maybe they won't. I guess the question is like, how do you like get out of this mindset?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is that people do have this compulsive, like self-destructive relationship to work, but they aren't crazy for being that way, right? They see how precarious life is in this world and how hard it is to get a job that you can actually like survive on and hold on to that job. And so it's really ingrained in us culturally from the time we're really young, right? That you need to get a good job. I think especially if you're an immigrant, you need to get a good job. You need to hold on to it at any cost. You need to be a good person and you need to like deal with this economic reality by like clenching onto it and holding it onto it as hard as you can. And so people are doing that for a rational reason, even though we take it to an irrational place where we're not listening to our bodies, we're not taking breaks, we're pushing ourselves to work, even though we're so exhausted, we're not actually getting any more work done, but we just think we should be like at the computer, forcing ourselves. And for me, and for a lot of people that I profiled in the book, and a lot of people in research that we see, it requires some kind of breakdown. And that is really, I've theorized what burnout really is the body refusing to be exploited anymore. So for me, in the story that I tell in the book, it was a 9-month-long fever every single night, 103-degree fever, heart palpitations, heart murmur, chills, anemia. And I was so weak that it forced me to rest. I profile a lot of people in the book where for them it looked like a burst gallbladder or throwing up blood in the bathroom at work or all kinds of different health manifestations. For other people, it's alcoholism, depression, suicide ideation, all of these things. And burnout is a really big part of the cultural conversation these days. A lot of people are going through it because we're all feeling that pinch, that push from all sides of economic pressure. But when we burn out, that is our body saying, I need rest. I cannot live like this anymore. The amount of stress, and I think we can almost think of it as like a post-traumatic stress response. I am traumatized by the amount of work I've been put through and that I'm putting myself through. And I think kind of on a meta level, we're as a society reaching that point too. And in a breakdown, there is a opportunity for rebuilding. So for me, I got that sick and that told me my priorities need to change. I need to find some other source of meaning in life other than being like an impressive academic. And I'm better for it. I'm a more rounded person who accepts myself more and can love other people more because I'm not thinking about work all the time. So I had this horrible breakdown, but it allowed me to remake myself. And for a lot of the people that I talk to, that's what's necessary, is really saying, what do I actually care about? Is it family? Is it art? Is it making a difference in my community? What do I want to have live on after me? What do I want to spend my few years on this planet doing? And I think I still want to believe, even though things can be so scary and dire right now, that we as a society can have that same conversation of, okay, our priorities are totally out of whack right now. What do we actually value? And how do we actually treat people in a humane way that lets them honor their bodies? And we have enough resources to do that. We just need to reallocate how we distribute these things.
Yeah, I see a lot of people right now where it's during the pandemic, we had like the remote work and now it's kind of get back into the office. But it's like I said, my fiance, where a lot of her work is remote, and I almost feel like the remote work is worse because there's no separation between when you're at work and when you're off work. And when you're at work, these are your office hours. You go home, you're done for the day. But when you're working remote, it's like, okay, like, oh, we'll call you at 10 o'clock at night. We'll call you at 4 o'clock in the morning. We'll call you at 6 o'clock in the morning. Oh, we need this. And as the culture has kind of shifted, it's like we talked about a lot, like more service industry, more online jobs. It seems like, and like I said, maybe you're not actually working the whole day, but if you're expected to pick up phone calls at 6 o'clock in the morning or you're on standby, that's just as bad or maybe even worse than working because you can't plan any time to relax. You can't plan time to hang out with your friends or to kind of like let your guard down. And I mean, I hope that you're right. That would kind of, we see this shift, but I see the opposite where people would rather get rid of the commute, but then they're basically working either on call or working the rest of the day, which it just, to me, is like you need to have time where it's like, hey, it's 7 o'clock. You're not answering your phone until the next day at 9 a.m. And you can't even sleep in because people are blowing your phone up at 6 a.m. because they're, in a different time zone. For them, it's the afternoon or whatnot. What do you think about the remote work?
Yeah, so this is something I published a little bit on my Substack after the book came out, because we have data showing really consistently that in 2020, once people started working remotely, worker productivity went up by about 40%. Across a variety of different industries. And I think it's for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. In some ways, it's more efficient. It's, again, that double-edged sword of efficiency never gets rewarded. It just ratchets up the expectations. People didn't have a commute. They didn't have the hanging around the water cooler. They didn't have as many kind of BS meetings. They also could never escape work and had nothing else to do, many of us, trapped at home during lockdown. And so people were working and working and working. That work-life interference, that bleed was constant. Your work setup is right by your bed. You're never away from work and not thinking about it. And so people worked tons more remotely. And we also see that in companies that have forced people back into the office, worker productivity has gone down by that same roughly 40% because people have other needs. They have to go get lunch. They have to go drive to work. When you have a commute, it means you're not as productive. But productivity is not everything, right? Like we sometimes need those hours, cumulative hours, chit-chatting by the water cooler. We need to take a walk. We need to clear our head. We need to like get away from work and have our actual lives happen. And even if you're just like in a really cold-blooded way, all you care about is your employees doing a good job. Even if that's all you care about, we know that people need time to flex their creative muscles and rest and daydream. Like there's a reason why people have their best ideas in the shower. It's while you're on a break that your brain is working on things and recombining things. That's why we need to sleep and dream and all of these different things. Like the human brain needs rest just as our bodies do. And we have created this hell world. Sometimes it feels like where you're plugged in to constant stimulation and constant work all the time. And it does not line up with how our like animal human bodies work. And I think most of us are paying the physical and mental toll for that.
Today's guest has been Dr. Price, the author of the book Laziness Does Not Exist. There's two final questions. One, where can people find you, get a hold of your book, Laziness Does Not Exist? And then just secondly, leave us with a final thought.
Sure. Yeah. So my book, Laziness Does Not Exist, you can find it anywhere you get books, audiobook, ebook, hardcover, whatever. I also have some other books on neurodiversity. So Unmasking Autism is my most popular book, and it is about people finding out that they're autistic later in life. And I also write regularly at Substack at drdevonprice.substack.com. And my parting thought is to really extend compassion to the people around you. I talk a lot in Laziness Does Not Exist about how our attitudes towards the people society leaves behind the most are really the most indicative of our societal sickness. So who do we get told is the laziest of all people? Like who gets used as our boogeyman culturally? It's unhoused people, it's drug addicts, it's people who are depressed and on unemployment for years. If you want to fight against some of these cultural forces that we've been talking about today, and you think where we're headed as a society is troubling, find it in your heart to give somebody on the corner some money, ask them their name, ask them their story, see them as a human being rather than a quote unquote like lazy failure. Look at the people that you've been told are like the most lazy and supposedly worthless in society and try to see their worth, because I think that'll help us build a world that actually focuses on the human element. Because as I said before, that's why we should all be here, is to take care of one another, not to be productive or only value the lives that are productive. That only heads to a very, very dark place. But we can turn that around with the choices that we make and the priorities that we choose every day.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.